The night sky over Cotonou was supposed to be calm, but instead it cracked open with the sound of gunfire, sharp echoing bursts rolling across the city like a warning no one was prepared for. Young people poured into the streets, some rushing toward the noise, others standing frozen in doorways listening. In their eyes, you could see the mix of fear and something else. A hunger. A sense that whatever was happening near the presidential palace might be the beginning of a story they had been waiting to write. Across West Africa, from Burkina Faso to Niger to Mali, this same generation has watched soldiers take power in the name of dignity, sovereignty, and a future unchained from old colonial masters. And on that night in Benin, they whispered the same question that millions across the Sahel are now asking out loud: if democracy isn't working for us anymore. What comes next? Benin was considered one of the region's most stable democracies, a nation preparing for elections, not for a coup. Yet the fact that gunfire erupted at all against a president accused of consolidating power and aligning too closely with France reveals a deeper crisis gripping much of Africa today. People are tired. The poor are getting poorer. Leaders are getting richer. And the ballot box, once a symbol of hope, has become a symbol of manipulation. So what truly happened that night? Why did young soldiers believe they were rescuing their country? And why did powerful neighbors like Nigeria respond within hours as if they feared the unrest might spread to their own doorstep? Tonight, we examine the roots of this attempted coup, the regional tremors it has unleashed, and why world powers from Paris to Washington are suddenly paying very close attention. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, stay with us. And if you want deeper, clearer reporting on Africa's turning point, subscribe and join this growing community. When we talk about what unfolded in Benin, we cannot begin with the gunfire of today without walking back through the decades that shaped the country's fragile political soul. Benin, once called Dahomey, entered independence in 1960 with hope, but also with a deep fracture. Its politics built not on ideology or national vision, but on ethnic allegiance. Hubert Maga rose as the first major political figure supported by the Bariba people of the north. Alongside him stood Surumigan Apathy, backed by Yoruba communities, and Justin Ahomadegbe Tomatin, supported by the Fon and Gaon peoples. These three men formed what came to be known as a triumvirate, a political triangle held together not by trust, but by the fragile understanding that each controlled a different piece of the nation's identity. But nations cannot be held together by balancing acts forever. Only 3 years after independence in 1963, Dahomey faced its first coup, led by Christophe Soglo. Many older Beninese still remember that moment, not because it brought peace, but because it marked the start of a long cycle of instability. Yet instead of ending the triumvirate era, the coup leader had to join the very political figures he tried to disrupt, forming an uneasy continuation of power sharing that fooled no one. By 1965, Soglo seized power again, ruling for several years. For ordinary families in Porto Novo and Cotonou, this era was remembered as one of uncertainty, parents whispering at night about soldiers in the streets, children waking up to news of yet another shift in government. These changes did not feel like national progress. They felt like storms with no end. That storm intensified in 1972 when a young officer named Mathieu Kérékou staged yet another coup. But this time, something dramatically different happened. In a region where former French colonies often stayed tied closely to Paris, Kérékou declared the country a Marxist-Leninist state, rejecting France and aligning with socialist ideology. It was a bold, shocking announcement, one that sent ripples through Western capitals and through the families of Benin who suddenly found themselves living under a one-party system. People still recall the posters, the speeches, the attempts to reshape Benin into a radically different nation. And in 1975, Kérékou renamed the country Benin, breaking symbolically from the colonial past. Whether ordinary citizens felt pride or fear depended on who you asked, but everyone felt the weight of transformation. Kérékou held on to power until the tides of global politics shifted again. As the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Cold War melted away, the world began demanding new forms of governance. The pressure reached Benin, too. In February 1990, under popular and international pressure, Kérékou was forced to convene the National Sovereign Conference, a historic gathering that stripped him of power and set the foundation for multi-party democracy. Many still regard that conference as one of the most courageous democratic resets the continent had seen at the time. That moment paved the way for future elections, including the rise of Boniai in 2006, a soft-spoken technocrat whose presidency brought a sense, however brief, of stability, but even stability can fade. In 2016, Patrice Talon, one of the country's wealthiest businessmen and a major cotton magnate, won the presidency. At first, people hoped that someone with deep economic experience might revive the country's fortunes. But very quickly, Talon began consolidating power. Formerly independent institutions, the legislature, the judiciary, key administrative bodies, fell under his influence. Parliament's term was lengthened. The presidency's authority grew more centralized. Critics whispered that democracy was being hollowed from within. By 2026, Talon was expected to step down, but he had already positioned his finance minister Romuald Wadagni as the likely successor. And in a region where elections often reflect the desires of those already in power, many Beninese felt the outcome was predetermined. For soldiers watching from their barracks, for young men in the marketplaces, for women selling goods along the highway, a belief began to grow. The ballot could no longer be trusted. So when the first signs of unrest appeared, they were not born out of sudden shock. They were the result of decades, yes, entire generations of political disillusionment. Benin's attempted coup was not an isolated event. It was the echo of a long troubled history converging with a new impatient youth. The hours in which the attempted coup unfolded felt strangely stretched, as if time itself was trying to understand what was happening. It began with scattered gunfire around the presidential palace in Cotonou, sharp bursts that startled families awake and sent young soldiers running through the streets. People living nearby later described the sound as too close to be a warning, too far to understand, and for many that confusion was the first sign that something serious was underway. The city, normally restless with traffic and conversation, suddenly went quiet. Radios flickered on, phones buzzed, and a single question spread like a pulse through neighborhoods. Have they taken the president? Inside military circles, that question wasn't just important, it was decisive. In every successful coup across Africa's recent history, from Burkina Faso to Niger, the first move is always the same: secure the leader, detain him, show the nation you are in control. But that never happened in Benin. As gunfire rattled around the palace gates, Patrice Talon was nowhere near a rebel-held checkpoint. He remained free, protected, and communicating with loyal units. Older officers watching the drama unfold knew instantly what that meant. Without the president, the coup was already leaking strength. Yet the young soldiers pushing forward believed a wave was behind them. They had seen images from Niger crowds cheering, flags waving, soldiers lifted onto shoulders. They saw a similar hunger in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea-Bissau. For them, this wasn't treason. This was a generational correction. They felt the ballot box had failed the people, that old alliances with France had smothered sovereignty, and that Talon's government, concentrated, wealthy, and insulated, no longer represented the nation's true will. Their hearts were convinced they were the new guardians of the Republic. But conviction alone cannot overcome disorganization. As dawn approached, the situation shifted dramatically. Over Benin's airspace, the rumble of foreign aircraft began to grow. Nigeria, the region's largest military power, had moved fast. Within hours, reconnaissance planes and transport aircraft approached Benin as a clear, unmistakable message: we are ready to intervene. For many ordinary Beninese, the sight of Nigerian aircraft brought fear, not reassurance. Nigeria is powerful, yes, but also unpredictable, and its intervention in past crises has left mixed memories across West Africa. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Men turned their faces upward, trying to guess what would come next. Inside military headquarters, loyalist commanders felt a surge of confidence. With Nigeria signaling readiness to support the sitting government, the coup plotters were suddenly isolated. Their communications were strained. Their allies, if they had any, remained silent. What seemed like a rising tide just hours before was now shrinking rapidly. Gunfire around the presidential palace softened, then fell away entirely. But Nigeria was not the only external force hovering over the events. News began to circulate, never fully confirmed, yet widely believed, that French President Emmanuel Macron had spoken with Talon as the coup unfolded. France, desperate to protect what little influence it still held in West Africa, was watching closely. The fall of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had already shattered Paris's long-standing dominance in the Sahel. Losing Benin, a strategically placed country with a major port, would have been another massive blow. Macron's alleged intervention, whether through a phone call or indirect channels, reflected a Europe increasingly anxious about its diminishing role on the continent. And yet the most decisive forces were not foreign. They were internal. Benin's military, like its politics, still carries the imprint of its ethnic past. Bariba, Yoruba, Fongun. These identities, once the pillars of early political power, remain embedded within regiments, alliances, and loyalties. When the coup erupted, these old divisions resurfaced. Units hesitated to unite behind the rebels. Officers questioned each other's motivations. Suspicion spread faster than orders. In moments where unity was essential, fragmentation won. By midday, the final signs of the coup collapsing were unmistakable. Loyalist forces regained full control of the palace area. Smoke thinned above the skyline. Soldiers who hours earlier believed they were changing history slipped back into obscurity, knowing the consequences they might soon face. For civilians who emerged cautiously from their homes, the emotional mixture was overwhelming relief, disappointment, fear of reprisals, and uncertainty about what the failed coup would mean for the coming elections. And yet beneath all this, something deeper had changed. A message had been sent not by the government, but by the rebellion itself. The young, the frustrated, the unheard were declaring that they were no longer willing to wait for change to arrive politely through the ballot. They had taken the first and dangerous step toward forcing the nation to confront its own fractures. In the hours after the attempted coup collapsed, the streets of Cotonou slowly began to awaken again, though without their usual rhythm. People stepped out cautiously, glancing toward the presidential district where smoke had hung earlier that morning. Vendors reopened their stalls, but their voices were quieter. Taxi drivers moved through the city with a kind of mechanical focus, as if trying to process everything that had nearly unfolded. The sense of relief was there, yes, but layered beneath it was something heavier, the realization that their country was not as stable as it had once seemed. For ordinary families, the failed coup felt like confirmation of something they had long feared but rarely spoken aloud, that the foundations of their democracy had been weakening for years. Parents who had lived through the coups of the 1960s and 70s could not help comparing this moment to those earlier shocks. They remembered times when soldiers patrolled their neighborhoods, when political uncertainty meant fear of shortages, random arrests, or economic paralysis. For them, the failed coup was not just a news event, it was the return of a ghost from their past. Among the youth, the same generation that now makes up the majority of Benin's population, the emotional landscape was different. Many had watched the rise of young leaders in Burkina Faso, the defiance of soldiers in Niger, the assertiveness of Mali's junta. They had grown up in an era where traditional politicians talked of democracy but rarely delivered fairness, jobs, or dignity. So when young troops attempted to seize power, some teenagers and young adults did not react with horror, they reacted with curiosity, even sympathy. They whispered that maybe this was the disruption their country needed. And when it failed, disappointment settled into the cracks of their conversations, not because they loved instability, but because they felt trapped between a failing democracy and a coup that never stood a chance. Politically, the consequences were immediate. The government, shaken but still intact, began identifying and isolating those believed to be involved in the mutiny. Analysts predicted and still predict a purge within the military. Officers suspected of disloyalty will likely be removed. Entire units may be reorganized. And as always happens in the aftermath of failed coups, an atmosphere of suspicion will linger in the barracks. Soldiers will whisper more carefully. Commanders will watch each other more closely. Trust once broken is not easily repaired. This tightening of control will not stop at the military. Benin's political space is already constrained under President Talon, whose influence over the judiciary, legislature, and economy has grown steadily since 2016. Now, with elections approaching in January and April 2026, the failed coup gives the government a powerful justification to further restrict dissent. Opposition voices may be monitored more closely. Public gatherings may be limited. Critics may be framed as destabilizing actors even when their demands are peaceful. In the name of stability, political competition could become even narrower. Civil society groups, which once celebrated Benin as an early model of post-Cold War democracy, now express deep concern. Organizations advocating for transparency and free elections worry that the attempted coup will be used as evidence that the public cannot handle political plurality. Their fear is that Talon's allies, and especially his chosen successor, Finance Minister Romuald Wadagni, will gain even more leverage in shaping the upcoming elections. People already believed the outcomes were predetermined. Now that belief may harden into certainty. Regionally, Benin's crisis adds pressure to an already fragile West African landscape. ECOWAS weakened by the withdrawal of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso finds itself confronting instability in a country once considered a model member. Nigeria, facing its own internal unrest and political uncertainty, must now reconsider how closely it should entangle itself with its neighbors' domestic tensions. And for many in West Africa, the failed coup signals a troubling idea that even when rebellions do not succeed, the desire behind them does not disappear. On a personal level, many Beninese citizens now carry a renewed sense of vulnerability. They do not yet know what political climate will emerge from this moment, only that their country, once predictable, now feels exposed. A door that had been closed for decades has been cracked open again, and no one can say with confidence whether more unrest will follow. From the outside, the attempted coup in Benin may look like just another moment in West Africa's cycle of unrest. But for the United States and the broader international community, what happened there is part of a much larger and far more complex picture, one that blends global power shifts, fading colonial legacies, and the rising impatience of African youth who feel increasingly betrayed by democratic promises that never reach them. In Washington, analysts studying Africa's political trajectory have been following a trend they can no longer ignore: the weakening of ECOWAS, once considered the continent's most successful regional bloc. When Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso withdrew earlier this year, American observers understood it as more than a diplomatic disagreement. It was the unraveling of a security framework the U.S. had long relied on to counter terrorism, support trade routes, and maintain some degree of political predictability in the region. Benin's instability adds new tension to that unraveling. Though the coup failed, its motivations mirrored those sweeping across the Sahel: disillusionment with Western-backed leaders, frustration with economic stagnation, and a desire for political models not shaped by Paris, London, or Washington. For U.S. officials who work in defense and intelligence, Benin's proximity to Nigeria raises immediate alarms. Nigeria is West Africa's most populous nation, a major energy partner, and a country already grappling with kidnappings, terrorist attacks, and internal political divisions. A destabilized Benin on Nigeria's western border creates the risk of new refugee flows, new smuggling routes, and even new radicalization channels. American policymakers worry that if unrest spreads, Nigeria's ability to manage its own internal crises and its upcoming 2027 elections may weaken further. And if Nigeria falters, the repercussions would reverberate across the entire region. Across the Atlantic, Europe watches with its own anxieties. For France, the attempted coup was another reminder that its influence in Africa is slipping faster than many expected. Emmanuel Macron's rumored communication with President Talon was not an act of stability, it was an act of desperation. France has already lost strategic ground in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Losing Benin, a coastal gateway with one of the region's most important ports, would close yet another chapter of France's former empire. In Paris, policymakers know that the world sees France as a colonial power that failed to evolve, and they fear that a new generation of African leaders, many wearing military uniforms, will continue building ties with partners who come without colonial baggage, such as Russia and China. Indeed, Moscow and Beijing are not merely watching events unfold, they are studying them. Russia benefits from the narrative that African nations are choosing new alliances. China benefits from being perceived as a nation with no historical chains attached. Neither must ask for forgiveness for past crimes, something France still refuses to confront. And when coups succeed, new leaders often look for new partnerships. For both Russia and China, instability can be an opportunity to step into a vacuum left by Europe. Yet the United States views these developments through a different lens. For Washington, the most significant threat is not the loss of influence. It is the possibility of prolonged instability, which creates openings for extremism, economic collapse, and humanitarian crises. American diplomats privately express concern that youth-led movements, though fueled by legitimate frustration, may eventually fall into the same trap seen throughout history: powerful military leaders casting themselves as liberators only to repeat the failures of the civilian governments they overthrew. The world sees Benin as a small country, but in global strategy, small countries often reveal the biggest truths. And this attempted coup has shown that West Africa is entering a new era, one where old alliances are fading, new powers are rising, and millions of young Africans are demanding a future that the traditional democratic order has failed to deliver. As the dust finally settled over Cotonou, life slowly began returning to its familiar rhythm. Market stalls reopened, traffic resumed, and children walked to school beneath a sky that just hours before echoed with gunfire. Yet if you looked closely at the way people paused before crossing a street or how they lingered in conversation, you could sense that something fundamental had shifted. Benin may have returned to order, but it did not return to certainty. And that perhaps is the most profound consequence of all. For the older generation, the failed coup rekindled memories they hoped never to relive. They had seen this story before: leaders consolidating power, resentment building quietly, and soldiers deciding they could no longer trust the ballot. They knew what instability could steal from a nation: trust in institutions, hope for the future, and the delicate balance that keeps communities from turning against one another. This time, even though the coup collapsed, the reminder was unmistakable. Democracy is not a permanent achievement, it is a fragile contract. And once that contract is broken, repairing it becomes painfully hard. For younger Beninese citizens, the lesson was different and more unsettling. Many of them had looked toward Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali as sources of inspiration, not warning. They saw young leaders and decisive breaks from the past. They imagined a future unbound from colonial influence and political stagnation. When the coup failed, they did not simply return home. They returned with questions. Why didn't it succeed? Why did Nigeria intervene so quickly? Why does France still seem to have a hand in their internal politics? These questions remain unanswered, and they will shape political conversations in the months leading up to Benin's critical elections in January and April 2026. And this is where the deeper danger lies. A failed coup does not mean stability, it often means the beginning of a more volatile chapter. The government seeking to strengthen its grip may suppress opposition more aggressively. The military, already fractured by mistrust, may become even more divided. And the youth, realizing that neither the ballot nor the gun has delivered change, may begin searching for other, more unpredictable paths. Benin may face not just political turbulence, but an identity crisis about what kind of nation it wants to be. This uncertainty extends beyond its borders. Nigeria fears the unrest could spill over. France fears another ally slipping away. ECOWAS fears becoming irrelevant. And global powers from Washington to Moscow to Beijing are recalibrating their strategies in a region that is no longer playing by the old rules. So tonight, as we reflect on Benin's narrow escape, we must also confront a sobering reality. The forces that produced this attempted coup are not gone. They are still there in the frustrations of young people, in the desperation of old political elites, and in the widening cracks of West Africa's democratic foundations. More storms may come. But what do you think? Is West Africa standing at the edge of a new liberation or the brink of deeper instability? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe Africa deserves honest, fearless reporting, subscribe and help us shine light where others look away.